Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Firstly, let me introduce myself. My name is Bagus Rifqi Dharmawan, and here I'm going to talk about the checklist consort of information included when reporting a randomized trial. So basically, in this consort text, there are 25 checklists. So checklist number 1 is about identification as a randomized trial in the title. So the title in this consort text is Effect of Aspirin versus Placebo on the Prevention of Depression in Older People. Next, point 1b, Structured Summary of Trial Design, Methods, Results, and Conclusion. So in here we have the important thing, objective, design setting and participant, intervention, main outcomes and measures, result, conclusion, and relevance. We can assume it as abstract right here. Next, point 2a, scientific background. So preventive approaches for many non-communicable disorders, from cancer to cardiovascular disease, have had major influence on incidence, morbidity, and mortality. Next, point 2b, specific objectives or hypotheses. So there are no evidence-based primary preventive pharmacotherapies for depression. And the primary aim of ASPRID was to determine if the use of low-dose aspirin reduced the risk of depression in healthy individuals 70 years or older, or 65 years older among racial or ethnic minorities in the US. The primary hypothesis was that low-dose aspirin would reduce the risk of depression, defined as a CSD-10 score of 8 or more at any post-randomization point. Next, point 3a, description of trial design. So the trial design is the ASPRID trial was a multi-center, double-blinded, placebo-controlled, primary prevention, randomized clinical trial. Next, point 3b, important change to methods after trial commencement. So the CESD-10 was initially administered at baseline and at years 1, 3, 5, and 7. On receipt of further funding, National Health and Medical Research Council identifier, we added CESD-10 assessment to years 2, 4, and 6. Participants were thus assessed for depression annually until the end of their participation in the study. Next, point 4a, eligibility criteria for participants. So the participant who can eligible this experiment is among older adults who were relatively healthy and community dwelling in Australia and the US and were 70 years and older, or 65 years or older if African American or Hispanic and dwelling in the US. Next, point 4b, settings and location where the data were collected. So the data were collected in Australia. Recruitment largely took place in primary care settings. And secondly, the location were collected in the US. Next is point 5, the intervention for each group with sufficient details to allow. So participants were randomized to receive either 100 milligrams of enteric-coated aspirin or an enteric-coated placebo. Next is point 6a. So 6a is about completely defined pre-specified primary and secondary outcome. So the primary outcome is about the principal outcome variable of SPD was a proxy measure of major depressive disorder, defined as a CSD-10 score of 8 or more. Because some participants may have had a CSD-10 score of 8 or more at baseline or a history of depression, this primary outcome pulled both incident and current depression. And then the secondary outcome is the mental component summary score was a secondary outcome measure of SPD. Next, point 7a. How sample size was determined. So the target of ESPRI sample size was 19,000. To assess power for the ESPRI primary hypothesis, we extrapolated from the extant literature that the risk of prevalent depression at any time in the placebo group would be 10%. We anticipated a 5% annual dropout rate and a within participant correlation of 0.60 between baseline and follow-up measurements of depression. Next, point 8b. So point 8b is about type of randomization details of any resurrection. So randomization of the study drug followed a block randomization procedure and was stratified by site and age 65 to 79 versus more than 80 years. And then next is point 9. So point 9 basically the same thing in point 5. Mechanism used to implement the randomization. So participants were randomized to receive either 100 milligrams of enteric-coated aspirin or an enteric-coated placebo. Next, point 10. Who generate the random allocation sequence or who enrolled participants and who assigned participant intervention. So the trial was conducted according to the Australian National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research, the 2008 Declaration of Helsinki, and the International Conference on Harmonization of Good Clinical Practice ethics and was approved by institutional review boards at all sites. Next is point 11a. So point 11a is who was blinded after assignment to intervention. So basically point 11a is same as 3a. So the ESPRI trial was a multicenter double-blinded placebo-controlled primary prevention randomized clinical trial. Next, point 11b. If relevant, description of the similarity of intervention. So when compared with a formal psychiatric diagnosis of late life depression, the scale has been shown to have a sensitivity of 97% and a specificity of 84%. Against a formal DSM-4 diagnosis, the sensitivity and specificity of the CSD-10 were 82% and 83%, respectively. Next is point 12a. statistical methods used to compare groups for primary and secondary outcome. So the primary outcome is about the G models, assuming Gaussian distribution with identify link function. And the secondary outcome is logistic regression, was used for comparing overall proportion of hospitalization at follow-up periods attributable to depression in the aspirin and placebo groups. Next is point 13a. For each group, the numbers of participants who were randomly assigned received intended treatment were analyzed for the primary outcome. So in here, point 13a, in results, there are total of 19,114 participants, including 16,703 in Australia and 2,411 in the US. So after that, we're going to point 14a. So point 14a is about dates defining the periods of requirement and follow-up. The dates is March 2010 to December 2014. Next is point 15. So in point 15, a table showing baseline demographic and clinical characteristic for each group. In here, as we can see, there are table 1 that show us demographic characteristic of participants stratified by Center for Epidemiologic Studies Depression 10-item scale, CSD-10, score of 8 or more at baseline. So this is the graphic. The graphic is like this. Next is point 16. So point 16 is about number of participant denominator included in each analysis and whether the analysis was by original assigned groups. As we can see in here, table 2 that show us comparison of prevalent scores of 8 or more on the Center for Epidemiologic Studies Depression 10-item scale at follow-up in aspirin and placebo groups. In here, we can see the year and these patients, aspirin group, placebo group, and odds ratio. Next, point 17a. For each primary and secondary outcome, results for each group. Yeah, in 17a, we can see there is estimated effect size and its precision. You can see in table 3 in here, 12-item shorts from health survey mental component summary scores comparison in aspirin and placebo groups. The table is like this. Next, point 18. So point 18 is about the results of any other analysis performed, include subgroup analysis and adjusted analysis. So in here, subgroup analysis of this participant showed no significant difference in the prevalence of depressive symptoms at annual follow-up. Follow-up year by treatment group interaction. Antidepressant use was not statistically different between treatment groups at baseline or across annual follow-ups. Next is point 19. So point 19 is about all important harms or unintended effect in each group. Well, in here, there was not found any research important harms or unintended effects. Next, we go to point 20, trial limitation, addressing source of potential bias, imprecision, and if relevant multiplicity of analysis. The fact that the Esprit cohort had higher baseline quality of life than is noted in other population-based studies of older adults probably suggests placed recruitment in favor of individuals who are healthy and reflection of this primary prevention studies exclusion criteria. Next is point 22. So in point 22 is about the interpretation consistent with result, balancing benefits and harms, and considering other relevant evidence. So in here, as we can see, as we study in so here is the point 22 is about the interpretation. As study in ascertaining endpoints and mentioning follow-up, this suggests that low-dose aspirin is unlikely to be effective in preventing depression in healthy adult older cohort. Next is point 23, registration number and name of trial registry. So as we can see in here, point 23, the registration number is this trial numbers register. Yeah, in here, ISRCT. Yeah, we can open right here too. So this is the number of the register. Okay, here the number. The ASPRI trial had multiple institutional review board approvals in the US and Australia. Next is the last one, point 25. Source of funding and other support such as supply of drugs, role of funders. The ASPRI-D study is funded by project grant from the National Health and Medical Research Council 1081901. The ASPRI parent study, which required participants and was responsible for all follow-up measurements, including clinical endpoints and other data capture, was funded primarily by a grant from the U.S. National Institute on Aging. So the National Institute of Health, Dr. Murray, and Heart Foundation by Dr. Reid. Here are the source of funding and other support. Well, that's all that I have that I can talk about this Consort. If I have around well, I'm sorry if there's a lot of my word that mistake. Thank you for watching my video. Finally, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.